Tonight's topic, as you're fully aware, is not the easiest of topics to deal with. It is certainly relevant, it's pertinent, it's meaningful, it's important, but by no means easy. I don't believe that we're going to find all the answers to this very large question, but at least maybe some insights, at least maybe some steps towards making peace with the world around us in our faith in God. Before we get into answering the question, do bad things happen to good people, some preliminary observations. First of all, one of the 13 principles in Torah, in Judaism, states that for every mitzvah we perform, we are amply rewarded, and for every misdeed, for every sin that we commit, we are appropriately punished. The Rambam makes this one of the 13 cardinal principles of Yiddishkeit, the belief that there is justice, that there is reward and punishment. To get a little more comfortable with this idea, with this concept, we had a little incident a few years ago where we were speaking to one of the community day camps and talking to the children there about the great mitzvah of mezuzah. And we were explaining how in the merit of the mitzvah of mezuzah, the home receives special divine protection from trouble, from disaster, and so on, and that without the mezuzah, we are left unprotected like a soldier without his helmet. A few days later, we received a very angry phone call from one of the parents of a child who was attending this camp. It seems that the child had written home, or had called home, and told his mother that the rabbi had come to the camp and told him that if you don't have a mezuzah on the door, you are without protection and somebody might die. Now she understands that the child is only 7 years old, and maybe he misunderstood, maybe he's exaggerating, but the very notion that for not doing a mitzvah something bad will happen, that notion itself, she says, I object to in principle. How dare you expose my children to something so wrong? The whole idea of reward and punishment was objectionable. But the truth of the matter is that whether we're observant or not, believers or non-believers, whether we are devout or secular, we all have a deep-seated conviction that there is justice in this world. And what does that mean? There's no other way to define it than to say, justice states that if you're good, you are rewarded, and if you're bad, you are punished. People who make no claim to belief or faith in God believe that crime doesn't pay, that eventually you get trapped in your sin, you get trapped in your crime, that good people deserve and ought to get good things, whereas a bad person deserves to fail. I remember talking to a woman who claimed to be an atheist, and she was very upset that her husband was getting involved with Yiddishkeit, was beginning to do mitzvahs, keep Shabbos, and so on. But when this woman lost her brother, who was her favorite brother, the brother who had kept the family together when her father had died, and then this brother, at the early age of 46 or 47, died of a heart attack, this woman, for years afterwards, could not make peace with what had happened and was constantly saying, why him? Why him? So at some point, I decided to confront her, and I said to her, I don't understand where you come to ask such a question, where you, the atheist, are asking such a question. What do you mean, why he? You know why. The doctor explained to you why he died. He showed you the diagram. He explained to you how the heart works and how the arteries can get clogged. Your brother was a wonderful man. He was a good brother. He was a good person. He was terrific. But his heart was bad. He had a bad heart. And the doctor explained this to you, and he showed you exactly what had happened and where the clot had formed. Why do you keep saying, why him? You know why him. Obviously, she's not interested in the medical facts. If he was a good man, then why did he die? But wait a minute. What kind of question is that? Whether we wish to admit it or not, it's a religious question. Secular people can't ask that. If you want secular answers and secular philosophies, then ask secular questions. But if you ask religious questions, then you have to be ready for religious answers. A totally, truly secular person, if there is such a thing, can't ask, why did somebody die? He can only ask, what made him die? How did he die? But why? What kind of question is that? Only religious people ask such questions. Why do religious people ask such questions? Because they believe that there is reward and punishment, that there is justice, that a good man should have a good life. We're also morally indignant, genuinely, sincerely, morally indignant when wicked people succeed. It bothers us, not because we're jealous, but because we're morally disturbed. It's not right. An evil person shouldn't succeed. We expect him to fail. We expect him to be punished. And when it doesn't happen, something of our moral fiber is disturbed, is bothered. So the awareness, the belief in reward and punishment, is really not limited to people who read the Rambam and who find out from the Rambam that there is a reward and punishment. It's deeply rooted in our heart and mind and psyches, without which we wouldn't be quite human. And so when this woman phoned and complained, "How dare you tell my child that someone could suffer for not doing a mitzvah?" What's the complaint? You tell your child the same thing, only you use different words. You give it to your child in more generalized terms, and we made it very specific. If you have another mitzvah, you have another merit. Does that not bring you greater deserving? Does that not mean that you have a better life, or should? Didn't you yourself tell your children that if you're a good kid, everything will turn out well, and if you're a bad kid, you will only make yourself miserable? So we're being a little more specific. We're saying that one of those things you can do that is a mitzvah, that is a virtue, that will bring you greater credit, is to have a mezuzah. You don't want to talk about the mezuzah? Let's talk about keeping kosher. Let's talk about keeping Shabbos. All of these things are things that bring you more credit, more virtue. And the better person you are, the better life we expect you to have, because we believe that there is justice in the world. It's not a jungle. Another preliminary remark. The great revolutionary changes that Professor Einstein brought to science began with some very simple observations. He completely revolutionized the thinking and the understanding of the world, the laws that control this world, by introducing the idea of relativity. Basically what he said was that when you're on Earth and you look at the sun seems to be moving, and you feel like you're standing still. When you're on the sun looking down at the Earth seems to be moving, and you're standing still. So he asked a simple question. Which of the two observers is correct? Since there's no way of knowing, there's no way of saying who is correct, we therefore have to accept that concerning the movement of the planets, which is moving around which, is only a relative observation. There is no absolute way of saying which of the two observers is correct. It all depends on your point of view, which means to say that where you have two equally convincing and equally acceptable explanations to a single event, to a single phenomena, then you have no explanation at all. Let's apply this concept to bad things. Take any example. Something bad happens to a person. Let's take a simple example. A person misses a flight on an airline. And it actually happened. There was this tragic airplane crash 2 years ago in Chicago, which brought about the greatest loss of life in aviation history in America. There was one guy who had come to the airport that morning to board that particular flight and was told that they had overbooked reservations and that he was bumped off the flight. It's perfectly legal. He was told that he can't get on the flight, it's full. He said, "But I have a reservation." And they said, "Well, we overbooked." He said, "But I paid for the ticket." They said, "We'll give you back the money." He said, "But I have to be in LA by 4 o'clock. And they said, "Well, the best we can do is get you there by 6. He described that event as bad. Something bad had happened to him. He was not allowed to get on the plane. But that's the plane that crashed 15 minutes after it took off from the airport in Chicago on its way to LA. And no one aboard survived. 15 minutes later. Now, you talk to the same man 15 minutes later, not only is he singing a different tune, he's dreadfully embarrassed because he had called the stewardess all sorts of names, he had cursed the airline, he had cursed the day he was born, and now he went around apologizing to everybody. Because it was not the worst thing that ever happened to him, it was the best. So when we look at an event and we say, is this good or is this bad? There are two possibilities, equally convincing. Sometimes we see the two possibilities and sometimes we don't. Another consideration. When a father, a mother, tells a child how they are to behave, how the child should behave, There are many things in the mother or father's instructions that the child does not appreciate. Child doesn't understand. What did he do wrong? Why is he being punished? What crime did he commit that he should not be permitted to play with the knife or to run across the street? He doesn't understand why he's being punished, why his life is so miserable, why he's being denied. How many times has your child said to you, when you refuse an ice cream, 20 minutes after he had his first ice cream, and the child says, "Oh, I never get any. You never give me any." But you just had one 20 minutes ago. But to the child thinks you're mean because he never gets any ice cream. He doesn't understand why he's being punished. But is he being punished? Mother thinks she's being very responsible in denying him the right to play with a knife, or the chance to run across the highway, or the extra ice cream. The child will insist that it's a terrible punishment, a denial, a deprivation. He's underprivileged, he will claim. Whose view is correct? Depends on who you ask. Ask a child, he thinks he's right. The adult's view, obviously, is the correct one. When God, running the world, sets up certain experiences for us to go through, there are times when we see it as being bad. We don't understand. Why can't we get on this plane? What did I do wrong? What sin did I commit? God says, from where I sit, you shouldn't get on that plane. Is missing that flight good or bad? Another thought. Before we sit in judgment and decide that something bad had happened, we need to collect evidence. There's a famous story about the Baal Shem Tov when a young couple, not so young couple, came to the Baal Shem Tov and asked for a blessing, for a bracha that they have children, because they've been married for many years and had no children. The Baal Shem Tov changed the subject. When they came back time and again and insisted that the Rebbe give them the bracha, he finally did. They left, and that year they had a little boy. The boy lived to be 2 years old, and suddenly, without any explanation, he died. The couple came running back to the Baal Shem Tov. What they wanted to know is, what did we do wrong? What mistake did we make? What crime did we commit? Why did this thing happen? Of course, they described it as something bad. The Baal Shem Tov said, in order to judge the event, in order to be able to accurately describe the nature of that event, you need some background information. Let me give you some background information, he said. About 100 years ago, there was a battle, a war going on, the Khmelnytsky uprising, and the Cossacks destroyed entire villages. And in one of these villages, a Cossack noticed a newborn baby, and having no children of his own, he picked up the child and took him home. When the Polish government finally put down the rebellion and tried to straighten things out, bring order back, they came into this camp of Cossacks and they noticed immediately that there was a child who was obviously not a Cossack. They returned the child to the Jewish community. The child's parents had been killed in the attack, but the community raised the child and he grew up to be a fine Jew. When this Jew died, his soul came to heaven, and the heavenly courts found that this was a perfectly clean, innocent soul, except for a slight blemish that had accumulated on the soul during those 2 years that he had spent among the Cossacks with the violence and the vulgarity and the non-kosher food which he had absorbed during those 2 years. And in order for the soul to be completely perfect, it was decreed in heaven that the soul needs to be born to a nice Jewish family, in a kosher environment, in a holy atmosphere, to relive the first 2 years of life. Because the other years of its life, it had already gained its own merit, its own virtue, so that all the soul needed was the first 2 years of life relived. So the Baal Shem Tov said, when you came to me years ago and asked me for a bracha, I refused because I knew that this would be the child that would be born to you, and I didn't want to be responsible for your grief. But when you insisted, when you gave me no choice, when you absolutely refused to leave without a bracha, I gave you the bracha. Now, what did you do wrong? Nothing at all. What went wrong? Nothing at all. What mistake did you make? None at all. Nothing bad had happened to the child. Nothing bad has happened to you. What about legitimate grief? What about the commandment to sit Shiva, to mourn for 7 uninterrupted days? Grief does not mean that something bad has happened. Grief means that something sad happened. Something painful has happened. And here's where we have to be careful when we use the word bad. Chassidus says that one of the ways that the Yetzer Hara gets us to sin is by tripping us up semantically. The Yetzer Hara uses certain words that are very subtle, and it gets us to sin simply because he tricked us. He used a word that didn't belong, and we got confused. For example, when the snake came to Chava, what did he say to her in the Garden of Eden? He couldn't come right out and say, eat from the tree of knowledge. What kind of human being would respond to that? So Torah tells us that the snake was sly. The snake came to Chava and said, look at that tree. Look at the fruit. Isn't that a good fruit? Isn't this a good tree? He didn't say, eat it. All he said was, isn't this a good tree? And that was the beginning of the sin. Is there such a thing as a good tree? Is there a moral fruit? It's really a misuse of the word. A tree can be healthy or it can be diseased. A tree can grow tall or it can be stunted. A tree can be full of fruit or it can be barren. The fruit can be sweet or it can be sour. But what is a good tree? And by the same token, what is a bad tree? A tree that slanders, that gossips? What's a bad tree? The terms good and bad, correctly used, must remain within the realm of morality. Good means morally good. Bad means immoral. So you can't say a bad car. You really can't even say a bad check. The word applies more properly to the writer of the check. So when we say, do bad things happen, we're not asking, do painful things happen? Of course, yes, painful things do happen. We're not asking, do sad things happen? Yes, sad things do happen. But do bad things happen? In other words, this painful experience or this sad experience, is there something immoral? Is there something bad about it? It's a very different question. So this couple who lost their child are commanded by Torah to sit 7 days in mourning over their son and to cry and to feel no pleasure in anything in life, to take no pleasure in life for 7 days because they are in mourning. But did a bad thing happen? What is bad? There's a famous story about a woman whose children suddenly passed away and her husband came home, Rabbi Meir, and she wanted to break the news to him. So she put it to him this way. She said, suppose we had a visitor here yesterday and he left his bags, and then today he came to claim them. Would I be right to give it to him? And Reb Meir said, what kind of question is that? Of course. So she said to him, God gave us children, and yesterday he came and claimed them. Would you object? Is there anything immoral or bad? But even after this explanation, did they sit Shiva and mourn? Certainly. So before we get to answering the question, do bad things happen to good people, let's try to define it. What is bad? First of all, when an event happens, there are always two ways of looking at it. There are always two sides. Which side is correct? We know in our own experience that it happens over and over again. We go through something and it feels and seems like something bad is happening. A week later we realize it wasn't so bad. As a matter of fact, it was good. And we thank God that it happened, because without that we would have never reached some other great accomplishment or virtue or whatever. Number two, if we're going to decide or determine whether this thing is bad, do we have the evidence? Where is the evidence? We're looking at it and it looks bad, but do we know what preceded it? Like the story with the Baal Shem Tov, do we know what God has in mind? The information that God has and the basis on which God is functioning is not available to us. So God sees past generations, future generations. We're told that Moshe saw the Egyptian hitting the Jew, and it says that he looked this way and he looked that way and he saw no man, so he killed the Egyptian. Now, why was Moshe looking up and down? Was he a coward? Did he not have the conviction of his beliefs? If it was right for him to defend the Jew and kill the Egyptian, why was he so concerned whether anybody was watching? Certainly he was willing to put his life in danger to save another Jew. So the commentaries tell us he wasn't afraid that someone might be watching. He looked this way and he looked that way means that he looked into the past, into this Egyptian's past, into his genealogy, to see if there was anyone significant and worthy among his ancestors, and he saw no one. And then he looked the other way, into the future generations that would be born to this Egyptian, and he saw no one, and so he killed him. Which means that had he seen in this man's past or in this man's future a person of great virtue, that virtue might have extended, that credit might have extended to this Egyptian, and he wouldn't deserve to die. But before we decide whether this Egyptian's death is a good thing or a bad thing, we need more information. Where does he come from? Who will come from him? What did he do in his past life? What is he going to do in his next life? We need more facts. We need more evidence. What about reward and punishment? What do we think when we see suffering or trouble coming our way? Or we see someone else suffering? The immediate question is, what did this person do to deserve this? We immediately demand justice. Show cause. Why is this person suffering? Did he do something bad to deserve it? Now, what if we should discover that, yes, he did do something bad and does deserve it? Then we would accept it as being part of justice. Sometimes a person has to take his medicine. He sinned, or as the expression goes, he did the crime, so he's got to do the time. So you're going to sit in jail. Yeah, you have to sit in jail. You did the crime, you got to do the time. We accept that as being just. Sometimes we take it to an extreme. God says, live this way. Don't eat on Yom Kippur. Or don't think unholy thoughts. Don't commit adultery. Don't trick anybody or mislead him intentionally. So we don't. Why don't we? Because we don't want to be punished. We don't want to suffer the consequences. When you take a look in Torah, and it says that if a person eats on Yom Kippur, he deserves a death penalty. If a person commits adultery, he deserves a death penalty. If a person does this or that, there is a whipping. And if the person does another type of a sin, then he has to die a natural death. Well, these are severe punishments. Who wants to suffer? So we refrain from sinning out of fear. Fear of what? Fear of God? No. Fear of punishment. And that can be taken to an extreme where it becomes really unhealthy and un-Jewish. If you've read anything about Hasidim, about Hasidic philosophy, you probably have the impression that Hasidim serve God with joy. Not with fear, but with joy. Constant singing, constant dancing, they know of no problems, they know of no troubles. It's an exaggeration, but it's based on some truth. Hasidus says, serve God with a positive attitude, not out of fear of punishment. Why? Because actually, that is the Jewish way. The Mishnah says, do not serve God with thought of a reward. Don't serve him for the reward. Serve him because he is God. He created you and he deserves to be served, not because you need a reward. Now, what greater reward is there than avoiding tragedy? I mean, is that not a great reward? If doing it for a reward is selfish rather than selfless, then isn't doing it because you're afraid of punishment also selfish? You're not worshiping, you're not praising, you're not serving God, you're defending yourself. It's self-preservation. So to serve God out of fear of punishment violates the instruction of the Mishnah. It's a Jewish thing to serve God for positive, optimistic reasons and not for self-preservation or the avoidance of punishment. Hasidus illuminates this and illustrates it with the following little story. Imagine a father who sees his son running around barefoot. So he says to the child, be careful, it's not safe to run around barefoot. Put your shoes on, because barefoot you might get a splinter and hurt yourself. But the child is not impressed, and he continues to run around barefoot. Sure enough, he gets a splinter, and the wound gets infected, and the infection becomes dangerous, and they rush him off to the hospital. And the doctor says, thank God you got here on time. I think we can save the leg. And he takes out these instruments, these sharp, cold, shiny instruments, and he pokes around in this very painful area of the foot. The child is screaming. The doctor finally gets the infection out, gets the splinter out, and saves the child's leg. Now here he's well again. He's back on his feet, and he's running around barefoot. So the father says to him, don't run barefoot, you're going to get a splinter. And the child says, well, I won't. So the father says, if you get a splinter, it's going to get infected. It's going to be terrible. And the child says, nah, don't worry. So the father says, if you get a splinter, I'm going to have to take you to the doctor again, to the hospital, and he's going to take those shiny, sharp things, and he's going to poke at you. And here the child gets intimidated, and he goes and he puts on his shoes. That pain he doesn't like. Now, what is childish about this? The father says to him, wear your shoes so that you don't hurt your foot. But that doesn't move him to wear his shoes. when the father says, even if you do hurt your foot, and even if you endanger the foot, there's always a doctor who can heal you. And here the child says, what? Heal me? Okay, I'll put on the shoes. He's afraid of the cure, not of the damage. When you come to a Jew and you say, God said do not commit adultery. So don't do it because it's ungodly. It will violate something in the godliness of your neshama, of the children's neshama, of the world in general. And you say, nah, it won't happen, I'll be discreet. So then the Torah comes along and says, if you do commit adultery, God will punish you. And so you have people who say, oh, in that case, well, then I won't do it. But what does this mean? What does it mean God will punish you? God doesn't take revenge. God obeys the commandments He gives us, and He commanded us not to take revenge, so He certainly doesn't. What does it mean that God punishes? If you destroy something through your own misdeeds, God will come along and correct it. He will fix it. He'll save it. Maybe a surgical procedure, but the purpose of the procedure is to save the limb, to save the life. So to say that I might commit the sin had you not told me what the punishment was is rather childish. You refrain from doing the sin because it is a sin, not because it's curable. That's a childish thinking. You should avoid the sin because of the damage it causes, not because it can be fixed. This way of thinking about the punishment, being more impressed with the punishment than with the crime, leads to another misconception, an unhappy misconception. There seems to be a belief that where the Torah specifies a punishment, that indicates that the sin is a grave sin, heavy sin. Where Torah does not prescribe a punishment, that seems to indicate that the sin is not so bad, not so serious. But the truth of the matter may be the exact opposite. When Torah says that for this sin there is punishment, it means that if you damage yourself and the world by committing this sin, there is a method by which it can be corrected. It's salvageable. But then there are certain sins for which there is no punishment. Why? Because there is no salvaging it. There is no medical procedure, no surgical procedure to save this particular limb. So when you look in Torah and it says that if a Jew commits adultery, there's a very severe punishment. And people say, aha, it's a big sin. It's a heavy, got to watch that one. But when it comes to having relations with a non-Jew, no punishment is mentioned in Torah. So people say, well, in that case, it must not be such a terrible thing. But the exact opposite is the truth. Maybe when a Jew steps out of the Jewish community, getting involved with a non-Jew, Torah prescribes no punishment because Torah has no prescription. Even if Torah has nothing more to say. And we know that in human relations, if your father will at least scream at you, will at least shout, then you know you still have a father. You still have a relationship going. But if you did something so bad that your father won't talk to you anymore, that's even worse. If he has nothing more to say, then the relationship has been damaged far more severely. Torah is constantly looking for ways to correct our misdeeds, how we can do tshuva, how we can make amends, undo the damage we did. When Torah itself has nothing more to say, that doesn't mean that the sin is not as serious. It means the exact opposite. Now on the positive side, Torah comes along and says it's a mitzvah for a man to have children. So a woman may come back and say, well, it's only a mitzvah for men. That leaves us out. Since it's not my mitzvah, it's his mitzvah, let him do the mitzvah. Why look at me? Obviously, they say it's far more important for the man to have children than the woman. Because for him there's a mitzvah, and for me there is none. But again, the exact opposite might be the case. For the man, having children is a mitzvah, something you're told to do, and something you will be rewarded for. But for a woman, God doesn't say, do this as a mitzvah. For a woman, having children, if we can say such a thing, is more than a mitzvah. Doesn't need to be said, doesn't need to be commanded. So that there's a mitzvah for a woman to have children, only it's greater than an ordinary mitzvah. It's a commandment that goes without saying. Getting back to punishment. How do we look at punishment? If there is something we did that needs to be cleansed and corrected, if we need to be put back on the track, in order to get back on the track, we need to have a little pain, then that certainly cannot be described as bad. It's obviously good. I mean, imagine the uninitiated coming into a surgical arena for the first time in his life, what that looks like to him, if you know nothing about medicine or surgery. What's one to think when he sees a guy strapped down, tied hand and foot, with a bunch of men wearing masks, wielding knives, standing over him? What are you to think? That this is good? But when you know what really is going on, not only do you see the goodness of it, these men went to school for 8 years, trained for more years, specialized for a few years. All of this effort, including the ridiculous hours they keep, all of this so that they may be able to be competent enough to save a life. They're not bandits, they're angels. The Berditchever Rebbe composed many songs. One of his favorite, one of the most popular, is called Adudala. It's a little ditty that he addresses to God, in which he says, wherever I go, there is you. Wherever I turn, there is you. I go up, it's you. I go down, it's you. I go east, it's you. West, it's you. Wherever I go, you, you, you. Then in the second part he says, when things are good, it is you. If God forbid not so good, then it is you. And as long as it is you, it is good. Because if God is punishing us, then it is good. So Torah comes along and says, in objective truth, no bad thing comes from heaven. Which means that God causes no bad things to happen. And since God is the only cause in this world, then no bad thing can happen. That's an absolute truth. Therefore, a virtuous person, a person who wants to grow spiritually, emotionally, mentally, when something happens to him or her that hurts, that is sad, they will treat it as something painful, something tragic, and something sad, but not bad. On the other hand, if something painful or sad happens to someone else, here you're supposed to object. Here you're supposed to say, wait a minute. As far as I know, that person is guiltless, so this couldn't possibly be a punishment. If it were a punishment, then it would be good. But as far as I know, this person is a tzaddik. I know I'm not. Everybody knows within themselves where they're at, but for the other person, I am to assume that they are guiltless, and therefore what is happening to them is not a punishment. So as far as I know, there is no ground, there is no reason for this person to be suffering. So this is not a corrective measure. As far as I know, this person deserves better. Therefore, I object. I'm obligated to object. I'm hurt. I cannot allow this to happen. If there's any possible way for me to stop it, I must stop it. Where do we learn this from? We see it with the first Jew, with Avraham. We are told very clearly that God came to Avraham and said, I am not going to keep secrets from you. I trust you. We're friends. I want to tell you what I'm about to do. I am on my way to destroy the city of Sodom, God says. And what does Avraham do? Avraham says, how could you? How could you? You're the judge of the whole world. How could you do an injustice? And so they argued. So the question is this. Some people don't believe that when a city is destroyed, God is doing it. And so they call it a bad thing. But Avraham certainly knew that God was doing it. God himself told him, I am going to do it. It's not a freak accident. I'm doing it. I've thought it over. I have my reasons. I'm going to destroy the city. And yet Avraham says, how could you? Where was Avraham's faith? I mean, he didn't even need faith. God spoke to him directly and told him that he himself was going to do it. Shouldn't Avraham have thought, well, God knows what he's doing? Wouldn't that have been a virtue? If we're being told about the prototype of the Jewish people, the first Jew, and how he served God, what kind of a lesson is this? That Avraham would not trust that God knows what he's doing? So what we see from it very clearly is that it is true that we believe that God knows what He's doing. And if God is doing it, as the Berditchever said, as long as it's you, it's good. But that's if it's happening to me. If it's happening to somebody else, then even though I believe and even though I know that God is doing it, that God is causing it, and that God has His reasons, we are commanded by God to pursue justice, and you can't pursue justice on the level of faith. In order to have justice, you have to have proof. So to say something dreadful is happening in Sodom, but it doesn't bother me because I have faith in God, as far as the faith goes, it is fine. But where is the pursuit of justice? God has His reasons. So for God it is just. But where is your justice? Where is your evidence that it is just and good? God told you to establish justice, not to trust that God is just. Of course He is. The question is, where are we with justice? Where is your concern for another person? And to say, well, God must know what He's doing. Of course. And God created you with a mind and a heart and told you to pursue justice until you have the justice. It's not enough to believe that God is just. And so immediately, in the beginning of our history, it was established that everything that happens by a divine plan. God is doing it. There is no other God. We're not Greeks. We don't believe in good gods and bad gods. But even as we believe that, and in our faith in God, that He knows what He is doing, we object to what we cannot see or prove to be moral. In effect, God says to us, I am the creator of the universe, and I have a job to do. I give life, and I take life. I give health, and I deny health. I am the master of the world. I am the creator, and there will be times when I'm going to be taking somebody's life. I'm going to be taking somebody's happiness. I'm going to be taking someone's health. When I do that, I want you to stay out of it. Don't doubt that I'm doing it. Don't doubt that I know what I'm doing and that what I'm doing is just, but stay out of it. I'll do that. On the other hand, when I give life, God says, when I give health, when I give happiness, here I want you to join me. Assist me in doing that. So that good and bad, in terms of our behavior, our morality or immorality, means that there are things that God does in which He does not want our involvement. There are things which God does in which He does want our involvement. When we do those things in which God wants our help, we are doing a mitzvah that is good. When we help God in the other activities, in those activities where He asks us not to help, then we are doing a sin. Therefore, a person may not say, since God is the master of the universe, and nothing happens without Him, if my intended victim dies, it will be God's will. And therefore there's nothing wrong with me shooting at him. It is wrong. What is wrong is not because you might kill a person who was not meant to die. No, you might kill a person who was meant to die. And that is the sin, because death is God's business, never yours. Life is your business. So if someone is sick, the doctor has no right to say, let God decide. That's very un-Jewish. If someone is sick and there's a possibility of healing him, you must run to heal him. Who are we to interfere with God's plan? This half of God's plan, we are invited, we are, as a matter of fact, commanded to interfere with. You must offer a cure. Another interesting statement. Torah says, do not stand on the blood of your friend. Do not stand by when your friend's blood is being shed. But the literal translation is, do not stand in his blood, as if the blood had already been shed. And what that tells us is that it is very possible, it is very likely, that you will come across a person whose blood has already been shed. He is destined to die. He is going to die for some divine cosmic reason. His blood is already shed, theoretically. And yet you have the commandment, don't stand in his blood. You have to object. Even though you are a believer and you know that no one dies before his time, yet you have to object like Avraham did. God may know what he's doing, but until you see a reason for it, You have to object, try to stop it. You have to try to heal him. You have to try to save him. What happened to Avraham after the city of stone was destroyed? He had begged, he had pleaded, he had bargained, and it didn't help. In the end, God destroyed Sodom. Was Avraham upset? Did he lose his faith? No. What did he say? He said, Baruch Dayan Emes. Blessed is the true judge. He knows what is right and what is wrong. So now you can ask, if you're such a chacham, you could have said that an hour ago and would have spared God an argument. Instead of arguing and then saying Baruch Dayan Emes when it happens, why didn't you just say Baruch Dayan Emes when you first heard the news and forget about it? If you have that much faith, why are you saving it for the end? After the fact, once we see what has happened, then we know that that was God's intention. If it is God's intention, then Baruch Dayan Emes. But until it happens, until it's after the fact, if there is a possibility that this person can be saved, that this person can be healed, that this person can be cured, this person can be salvaged, you have to try to salvage. Only after it's done, when it's after the fact, then you no longer have a mitzvah here to try to stop it. You're no longer commanded to do anything in this case because it's done. You can't salvage, you can't cure, the person's already dead. So that mitzvah is no longer available to you. Then you leave it to God, and the mitzvah then is to say, God knows what he has done. As long as there's a mitzvah upon you to save, to heal, to cure, to object, to pray, then it's not enough to say God knows what he's doing. You have to know what you're doing. The Gemara tells us that 40 days before a child is born, there's an angel in heaven whose job is to make announcements, predictions. This angel, in charge of announcements, announces that the child about to be born will be rich or poor. The other child will be strong or weak. And so on. Many things are announced and predetermined about this child that's about to be born. So we see that rich or poor is determined even before the person is born. Why then, when we see poverty, when we see people suffering hunger, we get together in our synagogues, in our shuls, and we proclaim a fast and we pray. And we demand of God that he make us rich or richer. Why don't we trust him? Why don't we put our faith in him and assume that he knows what he is doing and we're probably better off poor? You can do that for yourself. If you want to be content being poor, fine, wonderful. Who is rich? He who is content with his portion. But when you see someone else being poor, that too is God's will. God knows what he's doing and God is just. So it is God's will that he be poor. But what is your commandment? What is your moral obligation? What does God want of you? He wants that you should feed him. And if you can't feed him because you're also poor, then pray. Get together, fast, and pray. You say, now wait a minute. This is really difficult. If it is better for this person to be poor, and that's why God is making him poor, when you come along and make him rich, then you've denied him the virtue of being poor. How could you do that? This person is about to gain some great, wonderful merit by being poor, and you took that merit away from him. How dare you do that? If it's good for the person to be sick, how dare you heal him? He'll only have to be sick again later. And if it's necessary for the person to be sick, let him be sick. Like when a person needs to mourn, and you don't let him mourn, you're not doing him a service. It's a disservice. A person needs to cry, let him cry. Don't try to make him laugh. So when we pray, when we try to interfere, when we turn to God and we say, change this, what are we asking of God? What we're asking of God is this. Those things that God does for us that hurt, that are painful, we believe are really acts of kindness. Kindness that we cannot understand because it's a higher kindness, a more divine kindness than our appreciation can comprehend. Like the father who's being kind to the child by not giving him another ice cream. What we're asking of God is not that he stop being kind, that he be less kind. What we're asking of God is, in your infinite wisdom, in your infinite power, please find a way to give us the same benefits in a better tasting pill? Can't we have the same growth, the same advantages, the same maturity that we need, that we will acquire if we go through the pain? Isn't there a painless way of getting the same benefit? What would be a more painless way? It would be far more painless if we could see what is happening. Take a simple example. A person is married and he's unhappy. He's unhappy. He's got complaints about his wife, or she has complaints about him. They're not happy. The person is walking around like his life is over. He doesn't know what to do. He can't concentrate on his business. He can't concentrate on anything. His life is ruined. He's miserable. Now suppose all of a sudden God comes to him and says, I want to ask you for a favor. I have one request. There is this man or this woman who needs to be married, and they have a personality that is a bit eccentric. I'm looking for someone to marry this person. I created this person. I'm responsible for this person. I want someone to marry this person. Would you marry this person for me? This is your mission in life. This is your purpose in life. I will give you life. I will give you health. And I ask you only to make this one person happy. And she's not the easiest person in the world to make happy. Or he's not the easiest person. But this is the one request that I make of you. Make this one person happy. If God would come to us and ask make that kind of a request, we would do it gladly. We would do it with joy. We wouldn't see it as a burden at all. Certainly not as a tragedy. We wouldn't call it the lousiest thing that happened in our life. Which means to say that if we could only see why the pain, it wouldn't be a pain, it would be a pleasure. It's true in our relationships as well. I would do anything for my wife, even those things which I now refuse to do. All she needs to do is show me why you want it, and then I'll do it gladly. The only reason I refuse to do it is because I can't relate to it. I don't understand what she wants or why she wants it. And this friction would disappear if I could only see. Of course, that's a cheap excuse. And besides, I do everything my wife wants. I'm just using this as an example. What are we praying for? When we pray that all of these things should be changed, we're not saying that God is doing something wrong. We're not failing to believe in God's providence. We're not failing to trust in His judgment. All we're saying is, it is good, but I can't see it. And we ask, could you not make it so that it's visible and obvious to the human eye? Once it would become visible, once it becomes obvious, it would stop being a pain. It would stop being a sickness. We wouldn't see it as poverty. The Gemara says that a person should accept the bad things that happen as gracefully as he accepts the good things. And there was a student who tried desperately to understand what this means. Came to the Baal Shem Tov. He said, could you please explain to me, what does this mean? Enjoy bad things? Wallow in pain? Doesn't sound Jewish. So the Baal Shem Tov said, I can't answer you, but Reb Zusha, who lives in a faraway village, he has the answer. Go to him. The man traveled a long distance, came to the city of Anapoli, to the village of Anapoli, and he was certain that if the Baal Shem Tov didn't know the answer to this question, and this man, Reb Zusha, does know the answer, he must be a greater tzaddik than the Baal Shem Tov. And so he asks around for the holy Reb Zusha, and nobody knows who he's talking about. Finally, he was able to track down a man by the name of Zusha, a poor man, lived in a little broken-down hut in the outskirts of the village, and he teaches children. The man came to Reb Zusha's house, and he found utter poverty, illness, pain, suffering, which was not uncommon in those days. So he says to Reb Zusha, the Baal Shem Tov sent me to you. Reb Zusha's face lights up, full of joy, enthusiasm. He puts on his gartel, and he says, tell me, what did the Rebbe say? So the man says, the Rebbe asked me to ask you a question. He told me to ask you to explain what it means that we should be as graceful in accepting bad things that happen to us along with the good things. And Reb Zusha was puzzled. He said, the Rebbe sent you to me? That I would give you an answer to this question? He said, I don't understand. How could I know how to accept bad things gracefully? Nothing bad ever happened to me. And so the man understood the answer. He had gotten his answer. There is no explanation for how you're expected to accept bad things. Bad things are bad. You're not supposed to accept bad things. What the Gemara means is not that you should see something as being bad, but like it. That's not Jewish. What the Gemara means is you should see beyond, behind, beneath the surface of that which looks bad, and realize that it's just as good things, perhaps better. Only when we call something good, from our perspective, when these things are happening, we describe it as good because we see the goodness, whereas the other is painful, is difficult for us because we can't see the goodness. But it isn't bad. Practical application. In a conversation, this woman says how she regretted having an abortion. And someone mentioned something about raising children, and this woman who had had the abortion made this remark. She says, if I hadn't had my abortion, my child would now be 5 years old. So I called her aside and I said, wait a minute. Your child would not be 5 years old. If this neshama was destined to live 5 years, then it would be here today. If the neshama is not here today, then it wouldn't be here even if you hadn't decided on the abortion. It's true that the decision to have the abortion was an immoral one. It's true that you made a terrible mistake when you decided to abort. For this, you have to search your soul, find out where your head is at. How come your thinking was so wrong? How come you had such little compassion? Why were you not in favor of life? Those are all good questions. That's your problem because you made a bad decision. And you had the freedom of choice to make that decision. But don't ever believe for a moment that the life and death of another human being is in your hands. That's arrogant and it's wrong. This neshama that was conceived but not born is a neshama no less than yours. And just as you have a destiny that you're going to live out, it has its destiny. And there's no way that you can interfere with its destiny. The fact that you made a poor choice, so do tshuva. Search your soul. Search your heart. Where did such a bad idea come from? But don't ever take credit for life and death. That's not in your hands. This young man was walking home from yeshiva in Brooklyn Friday night, and this juvenile delinquent jumps out from the bushes. It's a little kid, and he has this gun, and he demands money. It's Friday night. The guy's walking home from shul. He doesn't have any money, so he brushes him off. And this kid pulls out a gun and says, "Give me the money, or I'll shoot you." He pulls the trigger, shot him point blank. They were standing 3 feet apart. The yeshiva boy took the gun away from him, beat him up, and he ran away. He didn't realize until he had gotten home that he was bleeding from his chin. What had happened was that the bullet had entered his chin, lodged against the jawbone, and because it was a leather-tipped bullet or something, it flattened, rather than going through the bone, it flattened and didn't go any further. It's a rather dramatic illustration. But here are two people living out their destinies. This juvenile delinquent had freedom of choice, to be good or to be bad. He decided to be bad. How bad? As bad as you can get. He's going to kill a Jew. Now, what does it take to kill a Jew? Well, you go out and you steal some money. He did it. With this money, you go and you buy a stolen gun. Well, he did that too. Then you put bullets into the gun. He did that. Then you hide in the bush and wait until a Jew comes along. So he did that too. Then you point the gun at this Jew and you threaten him. And you pull the trigger so that the bullet comes out of the gun and enters the body of your intended victim. Does that make you a murderer? You've used the full extent of your freedom of choice. This juvenile delinquent, he did it all. He used the full range of his freedom. He decided to be a murderer. He acted like a murderer. What more do you want from him? But did his victim die? This particular man was not about to die. So one, the juvenile delinquent, had his freedom of choice, and the other has his 120 years to live out peacefully because he is not destined to die. He did get a headache, though, from the bullet. When this woman says, "My child would now be 5 years old," what are you saying? that there is a child, that there should have been a child, he should have been 5 years old, but because you made a dumb decision 5 years ago, that's why this child is not alive. For your stupidity, a child died? Is that what life is all about? God forbid. Your stupidity, do tshuva for it. But the other person's life and destiny, that's not in your hands. This child did not die because you were silly. God does not create a life to have it extinguished senselessly. The murderer is senseless, not the death. What if the pain coming to you is coming from another person? There are people who abuse you. They criticize you, they hurt you. There are statements in the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Medrash that we are to take all this in good humor. We're to accept it gracefully, not to return insult for insult, not to take revenge, not even to say, I'm going to be nice to you in spite of the way you behave to me. You're not allowed to add that other half of the statement. You just have to be nice. Why? Because whatever pain you experience, that pain is your life. Don't credit it to anybody else. It's not somebody else who made you suffer. It's your life. Handle it. Use it. Grow from it. Become stronger by it. Since you're using it, since you're accepting it in those good graces, why should you be angry at the person who brought it to you? Yosef said to his brothers, you sold me into slavery because you wanted to hurt me. You had bad intentions. But it was not a bad thing. I am here for a reason. And the reason is obvious. I am now the viceroy of Egypt. I saved Egypt from a disaster by advising the king, and now there is food for everyone to eat, because I happen to be here in Egypt at the right time. And now that you need a place to come to, when you need food, I have food for you too. I'll provide. So you have to do tshuva. You've got your problems, he said to them, because you made bad decisions. You intended bad. But don't expect me to be angry at you. From my point of view, nothing bad happened. Elikim chashava l'tova. God had it all planned out, and he plans it for the good. So it is humanly possible to remain kind to a person who is not kind to you, to remain generous to a person who is not generous to you, to remain respectful to a person who is not respectful to you, and so on. Why? Because if you accept your pain as your life, then you grow from it. Then you are exercising your faith and your trust in divine providence. What about the other person? He's got a problem. But that's his problem. He's got faults. Those are his faults, not mine. And that is why we say that there are 3 ways to handle a problem. 3 levels of maturity, if you wish. One level is something happens to you and you cannot go on with your life. You're stuck. Something tragic, something painful, and you can't proceed. For all practical purposes, you stopped growing because you can't get past that event. Devastated. Obviously, that's not great maturity. A second reaction would be, I am a mensch. I am a dignified human being. I am strong. I am capable. I will overcome this problem. I will not permit it to interfere with my life. I will fight it. I will resist it, and I will win. And you do. That's more mature, but it can also make you a very angry person. It's mature, but it's not positive. You're seeing this event as an interference in your life, only you're going to fight it. You're not going to take this sitting down. You're not going to give in easily. You're going to fight it. It's a more workable solution, but it also has its disadvantages. Then there's a third possibility. Something happens in your life, and it's not an interference. It's your life. Your life is made up of hills and valleys, but that's your life. Therefore, when you come to the hill, that's your life. And when you come to the valley, that's your life too. You react to both exactly the same way, because you have only one response to your life. You like it. You want it. It's the only life you have. And you want your life. You don't want somebody else's life. The grass is not greener on the other side of the fence. If this is my pain, then this is my destiny, this is my life, and I will grow from it, not fight it. I will overcome it by developing it, by including it into the enthusiasm for life that I have. Because it's not an interference, it is continued growth. That's So I have no reason to be angry. I have no reason to be bitter. I have no reason to be overly aggressive. I certainly have no excuse for stepping on someone else's toes, because nothing is getting in my way. And the pain, that's not getting in my way, that is my way. It's my pain, and if it's mine, then I want it. I like it, as long as it is mine. And the same is true with my wife, my children, my family, my community, my people. If they are my people, I want them. Even though there are hills and there are valleys. There are Jews who are easy to love, and there are Jews who are difficult to love. But they are my people, my Jews. I don't want anybody else, I want them. And the same with my children, my wife. If it's mine, then I see no faults. If it's mine, then I cannot resist. I must have it. It's exactly what I need. It's perfect for me because it is mine. How realistic is all this? It is realistic. And in a moment of crisis, we actually rise to that level. We've all been there before. We've seen the world from that perspective. In those moments of crisis, we become really good, big. We become noble. We see the world exactly the way we're describing it now. It's only that on a day-to-day level that we have a hard time with it. But when we think of the people we respect and admire, we think of the people we stand in awe of, the reason we admire them so much, the reason we envy them, is because they have exactly this kind of attitude. Now, if we can appreciate it in someone else, if we are able to see it in someone else, then we can have it for ourselves as well. We can do it. And God expects us to do it, because He wants to treat us the same way. He wants us to look past what seems to be a fault on His part and realize that He really means well, and that this too will be for the good. We want Him to treat us that way. We want Him to look past what seems to be our faults. Sure, we sin. We make mistakes. We rebel from time to time. But what is that all about? We will eventually apologize. We will eventually make up for it. We will all eventually do tshuva. In the end, all will be for the good. And we ask of God, we hope that God would look past the surface, not look at the sin, but look at what will come of it. Just as we do not look at the event in the world and say that God is doing something bad, we say there's something more to it, and we'll soon see the greater good that comes from it. And then we deserve that God treat us that way too. We did an Avera, but don't look at the Avera. Look at what will ultimately be. Ultimately, we will do tshuva. The sin itself will lead us to goodness, and we will be good in the end. The sin is not as bad as it appears. And when we trust in God, then what He does that seems bad is not as bad as it appears. It is really good. So He begins to trust in us measure for measure. He looks at our sin and says, a little more time, they'll grow up, they'll all be fine. How do we apply all this to the Holocaust? Explaining the Holocaust. The truth, of course, is that we don't know. It would be cruel, it would be blasphemous to stand here and try to explain why a Holocaust. It would be blasphemous because I really can't even think in such big terms, in such big concepts. I can't imagine how anything would ever justify the death of 6 million Jews, or one Jew for that matter. It would be immoral for me to think that I have an answer and to be content with an answer. An answer means that I can now understand and accept the death of 6 million Jews. But that's German. That's what makes a German, a Nazi, a Nazi. We are not Germans. We are Jews, and therefore we cannot find an explanation for the death of 6 million Jews, because we have a Yiddish Herz. No explanation will serve. No explanation will do. No explanation will satisfy, because any explanation is limited. It's finite and it's human. What happened in the Holocaust is infinite beyond human. If even one soul is beyond human comprehension, then 6 million souls? And so, how dare you ask, why did it happen? Are you suggesting that if I gave you a good answer, you would sleep well? Is that a moral position to take? Because I explained it to you and explained it well, it is now okay? It isn't okay. Until God gives us an explanation, no explanation of ours will ever work. God owes us an explanation, but so far He hasn't given us that explanation. And we can't make up our own answers. I can't tell you why. But let's at least say something about it. Not why did it happen, what happened. What? Even if we can't explain it, we certainly can't ignore it. We can't live 30, 40 years after a Holocaust and not have gained something from it, not have learned something, even if we can't answer the question of why. Now we can learn two things. We must learn two things. First of all, without Torah, without God, without commandments, there can be no morality. There can be no goodness. There is no humanness without commandments from God. What happened in Germany proved one thing, that studying music and art, literature, architecture, and philosophy does not make you human. It makes you skilled. At what remains to be seen. In those days, if you wanted to study art, you went to Germany. You wanted to study philosophy, you went to Germany. Medicine, Germany. Everything was in Germany. It was the most enlightened country on earth. And we mistakenly believed that that made them superior people, more human, less petty. They're not going to steal from each other. They're thinking philosophy. They're not going to hurt anybody. They're studying art. And yet they were the monsters of the world, with their art, with their poetry, with their philosophy. There was this Nazi who worked in the hospitals in the concentration camp, performing experiments. And when he came home and found out that his chihuahua had been run over by a car, he broke down and cried. He couldn't believe it. How could anybody be so cruel as to run over an innocent little dog? What did he do the next day? He went back to the concentration camp to do his work. Where is morality? Where is decency? And if he whistled an opera, did that keep him from doing his dirty work? There was no goodness, because he didn't believe that there was a God who commanded it. And so he made up his own rules, and he saw no contradiction. He cries over a puppy, but not over the people he himself had butchered. So this we know. I don't know why the Holocaust happened, but I know that it did happen, and that tells me that people who trust in art and in science for their morality will turn out to be monsters. There's one other thing I know, that there's no greater people in the world than the Jewish people. We know our history. There were Jews who were told to bow to the cross and they refused. They were tortured, but they refused. When you take a Jew and you say, give up your Judaism, don't practice it anymore, join the church, we'll make you famous, we'll give you presents, a Jew refuses. He's not going to give up his Judaism. And that's very noble. We admire those people. Those are the heroes of our past. What were the Jews in the concentration camps told? They were not asked to give up their Judaism. They weren't told, convert to Christianity and we'll take you to Paris and make you famous, we'll give you a big house. They were given no such choice at all. They were given no options at all. They were told only one thing. You're Jewish, you're going to die. The Jews during the Inquisition refused to relinquish their Judaism. They were strong. They held on to their Judaism. The Jews in the Holocaust couldn't relinquish it if they wanted to. They were given no such option. And that left them with only one of two possibilities. They could die as Jews, or they could die resenting the fact that they were Jews. They couldn't give up being Jewish. That was not an option. They couldn't become Christians. That was not an option. They couldn't convert to Islam. That was not an option. All they could do is to say, I am dying as a Jew, or I am dying wishing I wasn't a Jew. Now, we have many stories from the Holocaust. Hundreds of books describing what happened in this camp, in that camp, this city, and that city. We know stories of Jews who sang as they walked into the gas chambers. We're told about Jews who fought back ran out into the forests and became partisans. We have all sorts of stories. But we do not have stories describing Jews expressing a regret at being Jewish. As far as we know, that didn't happen. 6 million Jews knew that they were dying only because they were Jewish, and yet they didn't regret being Jewish. And if that's not a greater martyrdom, greater even than the tzaddikim, than those Jews who refused to give up Torah and tefillin, refused to give up their faith and refused to bow to the cross, there at least there was an accomplishment. You didn't bow to the cross. You refused to let go of Torah. So you felt good. You were doing something. There was some reward there. But for the Jews of the concentration camp, not resenting their Jewishness, there was no reward in that. They didn't resent their Jewishness because they were bigger than life. They were superhuman. You know that this is the only reason you're dying, and yet you don't regret it. They are the greatest martyrs in Jewish history. So we know two things. That the Germans, with all of their knowledge, with all their culture, their art, and their sciences, were the lowest animals of history, and the people who died there were the greatest martyrs of history, even though we've had some very impressive martyrs. But they are much greater. They're in a different ballpark than the other martyrs who had given their lives for Judaism. Why did God gather all these martyrs into one place, into one time? I don't know. Did it have something to do with past lives? Did it have something to do with preparing the world for Mashiach? God hasn't said, and only He can say. But this is for sure. This is certain. My grandmother did not die for Hitler. She didn't die because of a Hitler. She died through Hitler. Just as a person who dies in an accident, in a car accident, does not die by accident. My grandmother didn't die because of Hitler. She died under Hitler. The person in the car accident dies in the accident, not by accident. Why it happened, I don't know. I don't know why smaller things happen. The why is a question I don't expect to be able to answer. But along the same line, if the generation of 6 million Jews was destined to be the world's greatest martyrs, what are we destined to be? What about the generation after the Holocaust, the survivors? What are we destined to be? What is unique about this generation of Jews? After the Holocaust, the great learning centers of Europe had been destroyed. It all came to a halt. The yeshivas, the academies, the scholars, the teachers, it all ended. What was left? A generation of untutored Jews. The teachings were interrupted. So we're uninformed. We don't know. We're recovering from a tragedy and we don't know how to handle it yet. We don't know how to explain it. So our faith is shaken. Our education is interrupted. We are thrown overseas into a different continent, to a different world. We struggle to adjust, to learn the new language, to learn a new culture, to make a living, to make sure that our children don't starve. So the education is interrupted, the faith is shaken, and our time occupied. The result is that an entire generation of Jews grow up not connected to their Judaism, to various degrees disconnected from Judaism. The average Jewish child today, born into the world today, is born into a home with little or no Yiddishkeit. And yet God expects this child to grow up and be a good Jew. How? By doing tshuva. Tshuva means to return, to come back. This generation, our generation, we, all of us, are destined to come back. It's very clear. Because we were set out in a place removed from Judaism. The only thing to do is to come back. So what is clear about the martyrdom of the 6 million is also clear that we are the generation faced with a single challenge. We are not given Judaism, we have to go out and get it. It's a new experience. But the Navi predicted it. The prophecy describing the days before Mashiach says that in the end of days, the children will find Yiddishkeit and bring it to their parents. Now, he had to be a prophet to make such a statement. A wise man wouldn't say this. A wise man knows that tradition goes from the grandfather to the father to the son or to the grandson. But who ever heard of a tradition going backwards? Who ever heard of children being more traditional than their parents? Where would they get this tradition from? And yet this is the miracle of our connection to Judaism, of our godly soul, of our rebirth. And it's happening now. How many people here today are more observant because their children told them to be? The children are bringing tradition to the Zaydis and the Bubbas. So we're a unique generation. We saw a generation of martyrs, we became a generation of Balei Tshuva. And that's supposed to be the symptom of the days before Mashiach. It's an exciting time, it's an unprecedented time. We've never been so well off, we've never been so free to be Jewish. As his father tells me, he's upset because his daughter has so much freedom. And I said, what are you upset about? And he says, well, she can do all sorts of terrible things. And I said, yes, but freedom also means she can do wonderful things. We've never been so free to be good. We've always been kind of forced to be good. Couldn't help but be a little bit Jewish. I mean, after all, if you live in a shtetl, what are you going to do? So there was always a little push to be Jewish. There was always a little pressure to be Jewish. There was always the grandmother who was going to write you out of her will if you don't behave yourself. And now, on the contrary, the grandmother says, Gesundheit, just as long as you're happy, do what you want. We have every freedom. We are the most free of all generations, so we are free to be good. And if a Jew does a mitzvah, it is tshuva. It's a mitzvah without thought of reward. Because what reward? Your mother looks at you like you're crazy. Your father thinks you're a shlamazel. Your friends don't want to talk to you anymore. What selfish motive could there possibly be for today's children doing mitzvahs other than the pure, unadulterated, unviolated Jewishness of a Jew? A Jew and Judaism. They go together. No ulterior motives at all. No hang-ups, no pressures, no shtetl mentality. Just Judaism for its own sake. Totally voluntary. It's beautiful. It's unbelievable. That we see. That we know. The why we'll find out when Mashiach comes. A final thought on suffering. Had a group of Baptist priests come to Lubavitch House to ask questions. They wanted to learn, so they came. And one of them asked, why is it that the chosen people suffer so much? It's a good question, but there are again two ways to look at it. You can talk about the suffering and try to explain why there is so much suffering, or you can look at it from the other direction. Jews do not suffer so much. Jews may suffer less than other people. Why does it seem that we suffer more? For a very simple reason. Because we're older. It's not that we've suffered more, we've suffered longer. Because other nations do their little bit of suffering, and then they're gone. They don't suffer again, ever. Because they're no longer existing. The Romans had their bad days. They have no more bad days. They're gone. So we say the Romans didn't suffer. They gave a little suffer, and that was it. So we think the Romans had it good. The Jews seem to be suffering all the time. But if you live to be 120 years, you're bound to catch a lot of colds. But it's not that we suffer more. We live more. And the more you live, the more pains you will experience. There will be happiness, there will be sadness. But because we are 3,500 years old, well, we've caught a lot of colds. And thank God for that.